the days of old, there lived a king and queen who said every day, "Oh, if only we had a child." But they never had one. Then it so happened when the queen was once sitting in her bath that a frog crept out of the water onto dry land and said to her, "Your wish will be granted. Before a year is over, you will give birth to a daughter." What the frog predicted came to pass, and the queen bore a girl who was so beautiful that the king was beside himself with joy and gave a large party. But later, right after the 11th wise woman had spoken her charm, the 13th suddenly burst in. She wanted to take revenge for not being invited, and without greeting or even looking at anyone, she called out loudly, "In her 15th year the princess shall prick herself on a spindle and shall fall down dead." So I think Sleeping Beauty is a great starting point for a discussion on the Grimm fairy tales because it's got a lot of different elements within it. Starting with the significance of this frog, and then moving on to the significance of the spindle and the concept of spinning. As far as the frog is concerned, and there's a frog here in Sleeping Beauty, there's also a frog more famous in the Frog Prince story. Frogs are an evil symbol. They are depicted in a kind of heraldry of the damned in Hieronymus Bosch. In the comedy of Aristophanes, the frogs almost function as a kind of obnoxious doorbell to the underworld. We see a frog-style chorus as Dionysus makes his way into the underworld to seek out Euripides and Aeschylus. In Goethe's Faust, in the scene in Auerbach's cellar, one of the drunks is named Frosch, which is German for frog. Also, in Book 4 of Paradise Lost, when Satan sneaks into the Garden of Eden and makes his way all the way to sleeping Eve, and he is busted by the sort of sentries, the angel sentries at the Garden of Eden, here is the line 799, Book 4 of Paradise Lost. "Him there they found, squat like a toad, close at the ear of Eve, essaying by his devilish art to reach the organs of her fancy." So he is described as a toad as he is planting bad thoughts in Eve's head. And then we will find out later in book 5 that that is the first indication that she has an idea to eat from the fruit. The reason that frogs were considered evil is because they were associated with spontaneous generation, that they came out of a swamp, no mother, no father, they would just go poof and they would exist in a kind of gestative, pollutal origin. And the reason why that was considered particularly sinister was because they were perceived as being not part of the created world. They were an unintended part of God's creation. What about the spindle? What about the concept of spinning? It's interesting. If you go back to Plutarch and the life of Romulus, spinning was symbolic of good housewifery. And it was symbolic of a kind of symbiosis, a kind of negotiated gender role for women, in that they had an obligation to spin, but no obligation beyond that. We read that in the life of Romulus. You know, this is from Plutarch. "For when the Sabines, after the war against the Romans, were reconciled, conditions were made concerning their women that they should be obliged to do no other servile offices to their husbands but what concerned spinning." And so if we associate the spindle with marriage, it's obvious the connection we make next is that by her touching the needle at the age of 15, we can connect that with a sense of loss of innocence. And I think it's funny. I wish they used the word spindle in German. It'd almost be funny if they used the word spindeline. They very much emphasize in Grimm the tiniest touch is sufficient. A tiny prick can put a woman to sleep, seems to be the moral of this segment. But if we're making this connection here, then it might interest us to compare the book with the movie, because in the book, it very much is her own free will to touch the needle. She walks up into an attic room where she finds an old woman with the spindle, she is curious, and by her own free will, she touches it and she falls asleep. In the Disney film, it is not the case. There's actually a very prolonged sequence in which she is in a dreamlike trance, sleepwalking, and she is led all the way up this flight of stairs, and the spindle manifests itself out of nowhere, and then she touches it. So it's impossible for us to say that she has fallen, so to speak, of her own free will in the Disney version. So that's a change. The other thing that is a change along these lines is the connection between the old woman who's sitting at the spindle in the book and the 13th wise woman. In the Disney movie, they are one and the same. This is interesting to consider as far as the book goes, because there's no linear correlation between Frog, 13th wise woman, or the old lady with the spindle, nor does the 13th wise woman reappear to hinder his progress, the prince's progress, later. The curse is her only manifestation. It's her only role. And let's remind of another difference between book and movie, and that is that in the book, she actually falls asleep for a full 100-year period. The last wise woman mitigates the curse from death to a 100-year sleep. Now, the reason I think it's interesting to mention Scripture in conjunction with Sleeping Beauty is because when we talk about our Judeo-Christian past, it is very difficult to do that still these days, because even today, so entwined is our understanding of the good or bad effect of Judeo-Christianity on the progress or lack thereof of Western civilization, such that it is difficult to have an intellectual conversation about Scripture, I think, because of our inherent prejudice. But we as a species continue to bring baggage to a scriptural conversation. We do not bring baggage to a conversation about Sleeping Beauty, and therefore we can have a conversation about all those things that Christians have been having for the last 2,000 years. Fatalism, free will, predestination, what it says if God has foreknowledge, all of that is present here. The person who is naturally inclined against Calvinistic predetermination and predestination might dislike the fact that the prince shows up precisely on the 100-year anniversary of the curse, and that the hedge just parts for him. American Disney felt the need to change this. It doesn't just part for him. He has to do something. We're a covenant of deeds. We like the deeds component of Christianity here in America. That's why that was changed. We don't like the idea that he just shows up and it opens for him. That's not the American way. Or at least it wasn't at the time that Sleeping Beauty came out. He has to do something. He has to confront evil. He has divine help, but he demonstrates his courage through deeds. It's not the world acknowledges what's in his heart. And this is why the Dornenhecke can be likened to the Feuerzauber in Wagner. In Wagner's Ring, the Ring of Fire allows Siegfried through it because he doesn't have fear in his heart, but he need not make any actual demonstration of that courage at that moment. Here are the lines. But now the 100 years were just over, and the day had come on which little Briar Rose was to wake up again. When the prince approached the thorn hedge, it was nothing but big, beautiful flowers that, separated of their own free will, had let him through unharmed, closing again behind him like a hedge. So the implication is that it wouldn't have opened for anybody, even though the 100 years are up. So this story wants us to simultaneously conclude that this was fated to happen, and yet its fatedness does not detract from the accomplishment of the prince. Isn't that interesting? It was certain to happen, and yet, even with that certainty, we're supposed to respect this individual. We have no idea what separates him from the other princes, other than coincidence. Because other people tried to get through the Dornenhecke, but they, in a very graphic sounding description, they couldn't make it through, and their bodies were hanging in it. So it didn't open for them because the 100 years hadn't passed. So for all we know, the only difference between his success and their failure was the lapse of the 100-year curse. So I have to say, I like what Disney did with it. I like the changes that they made. I like that he had to do. Now, when you make it into a movie, I think you have to do it the way they did it, or else there would have been no movie if it had just opened for him. But even pushing past that, he has no fear in his heart. It's not Wagnerian. It's not Wagnerian at all. He doesn't make it through because he's fearless. In fact, one of the most iconic moments of the entire movie, and I think it's one of the greatest shots in all of those old Disney classics, is the moment when she turns into a dragon, and the complete fear in his face is what makes that moment great. He doesn't pass through because he's got no fear. He perseveres. And that is an American story. That is an Americanization of a German fairy tale. And God bless what Disney used to be. So let's move on. That's why they get a completely different happy ending. The movie's got a completely different feel from the book. This is a rare instance. But perhaps the movie did rather better.